Okay, so welcome to our session tonight where we're looking at conductor auditions. We're going to be hearing from Alex Parker from BBCA and from Rita Renz, who's one of our BBCA members based in Canada. So we're going to start off with Alex is going to talk about holding conductor auditions. So this is from the band point of view. If you're recruiting someone, how you set about the process and what to bear in mind. Then we'll go on to hear from Rita, who's been going through quite an arduous selection process. So we're going to hear about that in more detail. Then I'm going to run through some top tips for if you're going for an audition yourself, and then we'll just open it up and have questions and just general discussion. So I'm going to hand over to Alex to continue. Thanks, Alex.
Thanks very much, Rosie. That photo follows me around, but I really like it because that was me really pleased, just giving one of my players the biggest sort of smile and beam for well done for a solo that they just played at the areas. So if we could have the next slide, please, Rosie. So I'm going to talk to you really from the perspective of if you're running a band, what do you need to think about when you're auditioning your next conductor or recruiting your next conductor? Because really you should be thinking about it like it's a job, because for many people, even if we're not highly paid, it's something that we might be remunerated for, and we should take it seriously, because for most bands, the conductor is the professional person in the room, or is at least the leader to that group. So why do you need to have an audition? Let's start with that question. That's probably the first thing we need to ask ourselves when we've got a vacancy. Before we think about how we're hiring somebody, let's think about why we're hiring somebody. So what happened to your last MD? You'll know that. Hopefully you left on good terms, or they're moving on, or there's a different project, or you actually haven't got a permanent vacancy, but you're looking for somebody to support you for a particular period or project. So at that point, you'd be very clear that you're looking for somebody over a fixed period. And then it's also worth reflecting on the last time you held auditions. Hopefully that's been a success for you, but it might be that it was actually very recently. If you haven't had a successful hire of an MD. So what did you do last time? Did you get a good result? If you didn't get a good result, maybe ask yourselves why. And maybe think about the fact, did you see a range of candidates, or was it that you happened to know somebody who was interested and they kind of were just handed the job? And that might have the pros that you could get somebody in quite quickly, but could have a disadvantage that you haven't really seen a range of skills that are out there. And kind of following on from that, ask yourself, did people know that we were actually looking? Was it advertised in a way that people saw that we had a process running for recruitment, or was there some reason why it was done very quietly? So just think about where you've been before you kind of plan where you're going next. Now, for conductors out there, the purpose of this section is to get you in the frame of mind of thinking like the band. So when you're going through the process, it's really important to start to understand what the band are looking for, because every band is different, and they're going to be looking for different things. And ultimately, when you start to think about a band, you've got to think about, are you a good fit for the band? Are the band going to be rewarding for what you want to achieve in your conducting? So if we could go to the next slide, please. There we go. So next, we know what's happened before. We might think we've had a good process. We might think actually we didn't have a particularly good process, and we need to rethink it. So now we're looking forwards. So what is the aim of the process that we're trying to achieve? which could have a few different things. Not the obvious, we're selecting an MD, but maybe there's an opportunity here to raise the profile of the band by showing that you're running a professional operation in terms of your recruitment as well as what you do the rest of the time. There's an opportunity for your players to experience different styles of conducting. That it's possible that they've only ever been taught in one particular way, one particular school of thought, and there's a whole range of conductors out there with different levels of experience and skills themselves, and maybe this is an opportunity to actually test what works well with our band. Does our band like a softly approach, or does it like a very analytical approach to being taught? So it's a good time to sit back and actually take a moment just to reflect on what you want out of the process. And at the end there, I've got raise hope and aspiration. There's a phrase, a new broom sweeps all, and thinking about that with your conducting. If you've had somebody that's been there for a long time, there might have been absolutely nothing wrong with them at the end, and you've separated amicably. Maybe they've retired, but it gives you an opportunity to think all the way back to, well, how do we structure things? Do we like the fact that our MD chooses all the music? Would we actually prefer a small committee from the band who's going to work with the conductor to develop programs and have a more collaborative approach to things? And that's very common in continental banding for bands to have a committee that work and develop the repertoire over a long period of time, so that 18 months ahead of where they are, the band is already planning that far ahead. So now we've kind of started to think about where we want to go. Rosie, if we could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. I feel like Chris Whitty doing this back in the pandemic. So are you clear you know what you want from a new MD? What are the band's ambitions? There's absolutely no point in hiring a conductor that's really driven to go contesting, and that's what they get up in the morning to do, if you are adamantly going to be a non-contesting band. It's absolutely fine to be a non-contesting band. They represent probably half of the bands in the country when you really drill down into it. But what are your ambitions? So if you are a contesting band, maybe you need somebody with the right level of experience of contesting. Do they have a track record of winning? But what does that necessarily mean? Do they want to bring in lots of players that they have previously worked with, and that might fundamentally change your band? In some cases, that might be what you want in a hire. So think about writing some of this down and putting it together in a job description. Even if your conducting post is voluntary, making sure that you've got something that really clearly explains what you want from your conductors helps make sure that the people that are applying to you also understand what you're looking for, because sometimes as a conductor it can be really difficult to know if you're going to fit with a band, if the culture and the ethos is going to work for you. And you might not discover that through a process, because we have a tendency for conductor auditions to be entirely focused on the band testing the conductor, and we perhaps don't get a great opportunity as conductors to get a sense of what the band is like, because people are on their best behaviour. They might be asking you to rehearse them on music they know really well, which might not be representative of where the band is. So the conductor's not getting a sense of the band's abilities, or at least a good sense of where their musical attainment might be, or as we said before, what their ambitions are. Because it would be hard work if you came into a second section band and without telling you, they said, well, in 3 years' time, we'd like to be the world #1 ranked brass band. That's a very different challenge, and one that you then might want to manage the expectations of, as opposed to one where the band want to play quite academic repertoire, if that's what they're after, and that's not your background, then maybe you're not a good fit. So a couple of other things there to think about in your job description. If you're paying your conductor, what are your expectations? And the musicians' union rate for workshop leading and conducting is about £50 a rehearsal at the moment, but that has some expectations included with it, which is not just for the time that you're there. You're also meant to be preparing for that session. So if you're not paying somebody and it's voluntary, maybe you have a different expectation of them turning up and winging it a little bit, or you might still expect them to be very prepared, but there's a different way that you can hold somebody to account if they're a volunteer versus if they're paid for that time. And then think about whether that's a payment or are you just reimbursing expenses, because they are different things. So that's some of the things that you really want to start to get to grips with. Thank you, Rosie. So how will people know to apply? Where can you advertise? And for conductors, this is where you might think about looking for adverts. So there's a few different ways. Some of the obvious ones, the social media. But if you put one post on Facebook, how do you know that people will see it? And if they came a week later, would they scroll through your particular posts? So maybe if you were to ever put some paid promotion behind a post, that might be the one to do, to make sure it appears in people's feeds and conductors are actually seeing it, because so often you go and look at vacancies on Facebook, and if you happen to look on that day, you'll see the people that have put an advert up that day. But if they put it up last week, it's gone, and you just don't know who's looking. So social media can be effective, but especially if you're using it in a free way, it can be quite instant rather than really attract a wide range of people. Word of mouth, ask the band to ask people that they know, and friends and go out that way. There's the kind of paid for advertising. So 4 Bars Rest have an advertising scheme that a lot of bands use. At Brass Bands England, we don't actually do vacancy advertising at the moment, because we think there's other ways that can be done. But there is also things like the BBCA, the Brass Band Conductors Association's Facebook page, where if you're a member, that there's advertising opportunity in there. And then finally, there's the director approach. Is there a conductor you've always wanted to work with, but you don't know that they will apply? Maybe they've just been waiting for you, and they haven't thought that they would be chosen by you. So sometimes that direct approach to encourage people to apply can be really powerful. So think about how you're getting that message across. Thank you. A bit wordy, this slide, but thinking now about that ongoing recruitment process. So how will you actually get people to apply? Is it that you send a text message to the chairman of the band saying, "Oh yeah, I fancy having a go, please put me in the pile"? Or do you want a little bit more information about people before you start to see them? So creating an application form. You could use Google Forms for that, which is completely free, and it's really good practice to do that in reality, because it means that once if you've got 10 applications and they've filled out an application form, you've got really consistent advice, so you can compare and contrast those applications much more easily. If you've got a question about previous experience and somebody's written you 2 pages versus somebody that's written you 2 sentences, you know that they've got different levels of experience, and that might not be a bad thing. Somebody's just outside of university, their training is fresh in their mind, versus somebody that's been around a long time will have a different type of experience. So pros and cons to all these things, but at least you can compare and contrast very easily if you've got something like an application form. And depending on how much time you've got, you could start to do some of the more meaningful things with application forms. So you could ask somebody in the band who's not going to be on your selection panel to anonymize the forms as they come in. And we certainly do this for all our recruitment at Brass Bands England. Rosie, who's on the call, it regularly will be the person that receives application forms. She'll take out all references to people's gender, their names, whether they're whether they're from a particular cultural background, so that the people that we're looking at what are their skills, what's their experience, can they do the job, and what there's a lot of evidence that does is it brings more diversity. Brass bands still have a problem with recruiting women into conducting roles, and I think you'd find actually that some of the skills that are put down in an application will be much more relevant than you would discover if you put somebody in front of a band and you had a very confident man versus a very humble woman who is not necessarily kind of using a lot of bravado, but actually is very technically gifted. So looking at people in that anonymized way can be a really big tool for increasing the diversity of the people that you eventually see in audition. So then there's a kind of double question here. Do you do interviews and then audition people? How much time do you have? If you interview people and you think actually there's 4 or 5 people here, we need to audition them all. Is that going to work? Maybe you do auditions first and you see a much bigger number of people and then you interview the few. So that there's, but like I say, there's an issue there about the amount of time. Maybe there's a process where you'd actually like to see a whole range of people, and you say, well, we're going to do a slightly longer rehearsal, and we're going to see 5 or 6 people doing 20 minutes each, rather than trying to do them for a whole rehearsal each over a number of weeks, because again, you can't really contrast over that length of time, because this week Jimmy has turned up full of beans and he's ready to go, and the next week he's had a really rough week at work and he's not playing his best, and so the conductor gets a different band in front of them. So that's the kind of reasons why you might think differently, rather than just say, this week we're going to have this person, next week we're going to have that person, week after that we'll have them, and then we'll make a decision over who we like. They've all had very different potential experiences, and so will have reacted differently to different situations. Things to ask your conductor, but also conductors, things to ask the band when you're in those interviews. What are your aims and ambitions? What do you want to achieve by being in this role? Why this band? Because there's a band out there for everybody, and there's probably a perfect pairing with a conductor out there for every band. But knowing why you want to work with a band is as much of a thing that you should be thinking about when you're taking on a role like that than actually what you're doing musically. And then why now? If a conductor lives up the road, why have they never applied before? Or what's changed? Is this a different phase of life where they're going to be with you for a long time, or is it a short-term thing? And then finally, who's on the panel? And I've certainly been in auditions with bands where the panel has felt questionable, to put it politely, in terms of the knowledge and expertise that the people on there. You sit down for the interview and they look to each other and sort of say, well, who's asking the first question? And there's not a plan for what or structure for how they're going to interview you. So if you are putting a panel together, think about who's going to sit on it. Have they received some training? Now, that might be you meet 20 minutes before the first candidate arrives and you put a plan together. You explain to people, I'm going to ask this kind of question to probe this kind of aspect of their conducting. Why don't you do this and you do this? And so you've got some at least a minimal amount of structure. How do those people on the panel know what they're looking for? Are they there because they are themselves good musicians? Are they there because they understand the culture of the band really well and represent the players, perhaps? Are they a good sense of a person's character? Are they good at sensing a person's character? All of which are valuable. But if it's just because they happen to be the longest serving member, but actually they don't really mind who the conductor is, maybe they're not the best person to be on the interview panel. And that then follows on to what basis will the decision be made? Is it that the whole band vote? At which point, again, question: Does everybody in the band really know what they're looking for in a conductor, or is that vote indicative and the committee don't have to follow it? Again, if you do have a vote, does that risk a good decision being overruled by a popularity contest? Maybe one of your candidates is local, very well known to the band, has conducted them for the odd contest in the past, but has never been a resident MD, and then everyone else is less known, and so but maybe you miss out on the more technical or more personable conductor because you've got somebody who is particularly known to the band. So do think about the value or the purpose of something like a band vote. Doesn't mean that that's not important, but maybe it shouldn't be the thing that is the ultimate decision maker. And again, to avoid something then like the band saying, "Oh, we voted for so and so, but you've chosen this other person," a secret ballot means that you can then take into account the band's views and decisions, but it doesn't have to be made publicly knowledgeable who the band voted for. So that's a way to think about that. So that's our kind of holding conductor recruitment process. If we could go on to the next slide, please. So when you're running your auditions, so we've either done our interviews or we're planning on doing them later. Let's think about how we're being fair to all the candidates. How long are we going to give them? I think if you should be very clear with what your expectations are for a conductor, because if you bring them in for 20 minutes and they've prepared an hour's worth of work, well, that's not giving them fair time to. That's not giving them fair preparation because they've prepared something much longer. So you're actually then probing can they think on their feet and adjust, which is something you might want to think about. But actually, you probably want a conductor that's turning up prepared, well able to know what they're looking for in that set time. And you can do that in 20 minutes, or you can do that in an hour. But being clear what that process is going to be is an important kind of decision maker for a conductor. So if you go for 20 minutes, you might see more people in a tighter time frame. That might showing how they perform under pressure. But again, do you want to see pressure, or do you want to see what they can do over a longer period of time? And the ideal would be that once you've seen several and you know where you are, then you would invite them back for a longer time as a trial, and that's then maybe where you have 2 rehearsals. So the whole process has taken you 3 rehearsals rather than 6 or 7, and 6 or 7 different conductors can actually be quite disruptive for a band over time. Then also ask to see the conductor's plan. Good conductors will have a written plan or a diagram or something like that they're using for how they're planning their time. They might not always write it down, but they should be doing that planning process in their head. And for the sake of an audition, I think it's quite reasonable to ask to see what that plan is. You should think about what you ask them to do. If you say, "I want you to spend time on this piece open-ended," that might give you quite a different result where you say the band are really know this piece, but actually we suffer with intonation, and then ask them to do a 20-minute rehearsal on improving intonation. And then you can see what they're like as a technical conductor versus actually the band know this. I'm just going to show you how I can beat time and look good doing it, because they're two very different things for a conductor. So ask yourself, why would you choose music the band knows? Because you're hiring a conductor to rehearse you, to improve what you do, especially in the brass band world where we do a lot of rehearsal time compared to other art forms. So why not choose something the band don't know at all? Even though that means that players might have their heads down in the parts, you do want to assess, can a conductor help players improve, and by doing that with a well-known piece of music, you'll find that that's a better way to approach it. So if we go to the next slide, please. So at the end, although consider this whenever you look at an application from somebody, it's good practice now to think about what's called safer recruitment and good governance. So are you going, do you work with children? Are you going to ask the person to do a DBS form, a DBS check? If so, put that in the job description so that people know that it's going to come up. Are you going to ask for references? There's nothing wrong with asking for references. You're potentially taking on to pay somebody for a job. So make sure you're going to be spending good money on good people, and references can be an important part of that. And good conductors will have references ready. They'll know who they can give you as contacts. So be prepared for that. There's other things that we call invisible checks and safeguarding as part of a safer recruitment process. So if you are going to do a DBS check, ask them at the point of application, is there anything I need to know? And that gives you an opportunity to sense whether they have something they want to talk to you about first, and so that you can take that into account sooner rather than later. Other things like making sure that you present them with the band's code of conduct and explain that while they're with you, you expect them to follow the same code of conduct as all the players, because that helps build a team where everybody's respecting each other. And then think about the casual tests. Who's at the door when people arrive? And for that casual conversation where you can learn a lot about a person's character. Do they often open the door for you, or when you say hello, do they say hello back to treat the person that's maybe your band admin person that's there welcoming people and holding them back while there's another person doing their 20 minutes. So think about that casual part of the interview as well. And then finally, when you've made a decision, make your offer in writing, so it's really clear what you're offering, so that there's no discussion 2 months down the line. Oh, I thought you were paying me this, or my rate is this, but you as the band actually can't afford that rate. So make sure you put it in writing what the offer is. And many bands don't have the right employment things in place. So since IR35 came in, there's a very tight definition of who is an employee. This is UK based particularly. That means it's not up to you whether somebody's an employee. They are an employee if they meet certain conditions. So making sure you've got a contract, if you expect them to pay tax on their earnings, or you're going to pay that on their behalf, then make sure that's clear. And I mentioned that code of conduct. And also be clear, do you want your conductor to be present in your board meetings or your committee meetings? If you want them to be present, that's fine. But there are always going to be things that you need to be able to discuss, especially if you are employing that person. There's a different bias to that. So you need to be able to have a safe space to talk about issues that may be arising. But also we all know that conductors can be the professional or expert in the room when you're doing those things. So you might expect more from your conductor than just music. You might want to lean on them for advice around other things, but be clear, because not every conductor is comfortable doing that. So again, make sure you explain to them at that point whether you expect them at board meetings or not. And then when you're onboarding your conductor, give them some band info. And that's not necessary. That I don't really mean that. Don't give them the band history and say, go home and read that and come back next week as if you know everything about the band's history. What matters to them is actually how does the band function? What's its committee structure? Where does the money come from? What's the system for getting things out of the library? All these things that actually are the functional introduction that a conductor needs to an organisation. So I think that's kind of coming to the end. Oh, sorry. Just swallowed the wrong way. Oh.
Oh, thanks, Alex.
Yeah, sorry.
Have a glass of water. Thanks very much. There's lots of useful things for bands to think about there that I'm sure would definitely help in the recruitment process.